Chapter 1. Turning Point in the Dark. The Parisian night rain fell silently, the drops sliding down the office window. Maigret sat silently, his pipe cold in his hand. Before him lay open the transcript of Madame Pardon's testimony, the ink smearing as if it too wanted to disappear. There was one sentence, just one sentence, but it was enough to break the entire structure of the case. I saw him on the bridge at 10 to 6. That statement completely contradicts the testimony of the main witness, who claimed to have been chatting with the victim at a pub on the other side of the city. At that exact time, Maigret leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The image of the dead man appeared vaguely. If Madame Pardon was right, the man in the tavern could not have been the victim, or the victim had been replaced. There was a soft knock on the door. The police station clerk handed in an unmarked envelope. Maigret opened it. Inside was an old, yellowed photograph of a group of people on the riverbank, and in the middle was the face he had just seen in his memory, but at least 10 years younger. In the corner of the photo, a pencil mark crossed out. No explanation. Maigret sensed clearly this case was no longer simple. Someone was leading him down another path, both to reveal the truth and to conceal a greater truth. Outside, the street lights swayed in the rain. A slender figure stood silently across the street, turning away as he looked out. He put on his coat, grabbed his umbrella, and walked out of the office. This time, he would not tell anyone about the new line of investigation because he knew the more people who knew, the more danger would come. Chapter 2. The man standing in the rain. The figure remained standing under the lamppost, motionless as a stone statue. Maigret crossed the street, the steam rising from the sewers, warm in the cold air. When he was about 10 meters away, the figure turned slightly. A thin face, deep-set eyes. It was difficult to tell whether it was a man or a woman in the dim light. Inspector. The voice was soft, almost drowning in the rain. No one believes me, but I saw him. Maigret paused, tilting his head. Him. Who was with him that night? Not at the tavern. At the Pont Saint-Michel. A gust of wind carried the smell of river mud and car exhaust. When Maigret tried to ask more questions, the man quickly stuffed a sodden piece of paper into his hand and turned, disappearing into the narrow, dark alley. He did not pursue instinct, told him that any hasty movement would cause the witness to disappear forever. The paper was blurred by the rain, but a few words were still readable. Search in the 1938 missing person file. Name: L. Dufresne. Maigret knew the name. The old case had been classified as inconclusive. A girl had vanished on her way home. No body, no witnesses. Just a few rumors that she had run off with a mysterious man. He walked slowly back to his office, still clutching the paper as if afraid it would disappear. The case he was working on had suddenly opened up a dark branch, and that branch stretched back more than 20 years, long enough for all involved to think the truth was dead. A familiar feeling rose in his heart. The truth never died. It just slept, waiting for someone to awaken it. Chapter 3: Forgotten Records. Inside the office, the desk lamp shone on the weathered wood of the desk. Maigret laid the wet paper on a clean towel, as if handling fragile evidence. He opened the bottom drawer and took out an old set of keys, the ones he needed to access the basement storage room. The heavy iron door creaked as it opened. The smell of rotting paper and old dust filled the air. Maigret walked down the shelves and found the file marked 1938. It looked as if no one had touched it for years. He pulled out a hardcover volume with the spine marked "The Disappearance, Lucille Dufresne." Inside were only a few witness statements, blurry black and white photographs, and a brief report of the investigation. No trace found. Case closed on December 12, 1938. But what stopped Maigret was a photograph of Lucille standing in front of a small cafe in Bergerac. Beside her, a man in a long coat, a hat half covering his face. In the right corner of the photo was a round police seal and a familiar signature. Maigret frowned. The same signature appeared on a transcript of a case he was currently investigating. The two cases were more than 20 years apart, but they had the same name. He rummaged through the file. At the bottom of the file was a loose sheet of paper, yellowed and almost torn from another notebook. Can't continue. Too many people will be exposed. J. Maigret leaned back in his wooden chair, staring at the damp ceiling. If Jay was who he was thinking of, then this was more than just a murder case. It was a decades-long cover-up, perpetrated by those still in power. Outside, the rain had stopped, but Maigret knew the real storm had only just begun. Chapter 4. The Survivor. The woman opened the door just a crack, just enough to reveal pale gray eyes gleaming behind thick glasses. "Inspector, I thought you were dead," she said hoarsely, not in surprise, but as if she had expected it. The apartment on the third floor of an old building on the Rue Saint-Antoine smelled of damp and cheap cigarettes. Maigret entered, hanging his hat on a shaky wooden hook. On the wall hung a single small painting, a portrait of a young Lucille Dufresne, the brushstrokes blurred like a shadow of a drowned memory. "Do you know why I am here?" Maigret asked, his eyes never leaving the painting. She nodded, then poured 2 glasses of cheap cognac, pushing one toward him. "They got there before you," she said, her hands shaking. "2 days ago, a man and a woman. They told me to forget everything, forget Lucille, or else." She did not finish her sentence, but Maigret saw the fresh bruises on her thin wrists, like makeshift shackles. "You know the man in the photograph." She took a deep breath, her eyes looking far away. His name was Jules Morel, but everyone called him Le Chiffre, because he never appeared without leaving a number. Maigret immediately remembered the loose leaf in the file, the letter J at the end of the line. A chill ran down his spine. She got up quickly, walked to the window, and drew back the curtain. "You should go now. They are downstairs." Maigret moved forward, glancing down the street. A black Citroën was parked silently across the street, its windows darkly tinted. For a moment, he saw a small dot of light, a lit cigarette. The apartment suddenly became so quiet that he could hear his own heartbeat. Maigret knew that if he left now, he would be followed, but if he stayed, she might not survive the night. He slowly put down his glass of cognac and said softly, "You are not the only one who remembers, Madame. But from now on, things will be much more dangerous." Chapter 5. Surrounded in the dark. Maigret stood by the window, his eyes still fixed on the black Citroën. The man in the car showed no signs of impatience, as if he knew he would have to leave sooner or later. He turned to the woman. "Do you have another way out?" She nodded, pointing to a low wooden door at the end of the hall. "The way down to the cellar, but it leads to a dead end." Maigret smiled faintly. "Dead ends exist only for those who do not know the detours." He walked quickly and opened the cellar door. The smell of damp and rotten wood hit him in the face. The yellow incandescent light bulb flickered, casting distorted shadows on the stone walls. Maigret walked along the shelves of wine until he came to a wall that looked newly plastered. He bent down and pushed it gently. The wall opened, revealing a narrow, dark passage. "This way was used during the war," she explained, her voice trembling in a whisper. "Few people remember." Maigret walked ahead, listening to her footsteps dragging behind him. The alley opened into a small courtyard at the end of the tunnel, cold moonlight streaming across the mottled bricks. In the distance, he heard the Citroën engine start up. They had lost sight of him. "Now, go find a safe place. Don't contact anyone unless I come in person," Maigret said, handing her a piece of paper with a secret address. "And remember, don't drink anything anyone gives you." As she disappeared, Maigret took a cigarette from his pocket and lit it. The smoke curled into the darkness. He knew that escaping surveillance was not just a game of cat and mouse. It was a declaration of war. Before leaving the field, he pulled out his notebook and wrote a line, "Jules Morel, Le Chiffre," starting in 1938. The bells of St. Paul's Cathedral rang out, signaling midnight. In the darkness, Maigret's eyes gleamed with determination and the shadow of an old obsession that had just come back to life. Chapter 6. The Nameless Messenger. The Le Mistral pub is tucked away in a damp street in the 11th arrondissement. The dim yellow light barely illuminating the silhouettes of men bowing their heads over glasses of absinthe. The smell of cigarette smoke, old beer, and pungent sweat mixed together, covering the space like a damp blanket. Maigret entered, his hat pulled low. No one looked back, but he knew that at least 3 pairs of eyes were watching him. A woman at the counter nodded slightly, gesturing toward the end table, where a thin figure, wrapped tightly in a gray scarf, waited. The man looked up as Maigret sat down. His eyes were sharp as knives, but his gaze was unsteady. A man accustomed to living between fear and betrayal. You want to know about Le Chiffre, he said, without beating around the bush. Maigret did not answer immediately, but lit a cigarette. I want to know why a man who disappeared from the records in 1938 is now hanging around Paris, and why he is interested in a woman who has nothing to do with him. He licked his lips, leaning over his drink. He's not just interested in her. Le Chiffre is after a list, something that could sell the life of anyone in the business. He looked up, his voice low, and I think she has it. Maigret leaned back, letting the smoke curl up to obscure his eyes. You're talking about a secret list of whose... He smiled faintly, but the smile faded quickly. Of people who never want their names read aloud in public. Politicians, policemen, even judges. Maigret felt a chill run down his spine. This was no longer a mere surveillance or threat. It was an undercurrent that could sweep away all defenses. As he rose to leave the cafe, Maigret glanced through the window. The black Citroën parked at the end of the street had disappeared. That did not reassure him. On the contrary, he knew that the game had just moved on to a new one, and the pieces were moving faster than he had thought. Chapter 7. Shadow in the Hallway. Mornings at the Quai des Orfèvres usually began with the smell of strong coffee and the tapping of typewriters. But today, the air was thick, as if the whole building were keeping a secret. Maigret stepped through the large doors, his rain-soaked shoes leaving tracks on the stone floor. The room was dotted with investigators, each busy or pretending to be busy. He noticed something strange. No one dared to look at him for more than a few seconds. In the office, the case files were still lying there, as they had been the night before. But the report Maigret had left on the desk was gone. It contained copies of 2 telegrams concerning Le Chiffre. No one but he and Janvier knew about it. Maigret rang Janvier. He appeared a few minutes later, breathing hard, his coat wet with rain. "Where have you been this morning?" Maigret asked. "Following a middleman at Les Halles. But he disappeared before I got there." "And report?" Janvier frowned. "I haven't touched him." A flash of doubt crossed Maigret's mind. Not because he didn't trust Janvier, but because if Janvier hadn't taken it, who would have been bold enough to come in here? He left the office and walked down the narrow back corridor that led to the archives. Footsteps sounded ahead. A tall, broad-shouldered figure in a beige raincoat was trying to slip into the dark corner. Maigret accelerated, but when he turned in, it was empty. Only the iron door leading down to the archives vault closed softly. Maigret pushed open the door, and the smell of old, damp paper filled the air. On the floor lay a single, torn piece of paper, the corner of a torn copy of a telegram. He put it in his pocket, knowing full well that this meant the traitor was not far away. He was in this very building. Chapter 8. The Trap in the Heart of Ownership. Maigret sat pensively behind his desk, his half-burnt pipe leaving a thin trail of smoke around the lamp. In his mind, the torn piece of paper he had found in the vault was like a thorn, cutting gently but deeply. If the traitor is right here, the best weapon is not an arrest warrant. It's to make him believe that the opportunity is still open. He called Janvier, Lucas, and Torrance into the room and closed the door. You three are the only ones I trust. From now on, all information about this case will be classified. I will release a false report, something important enough that he cannot ignore it. The fake report was handwritten, detailing a secret meeting that evening at Pier 14 involving a witness who would hand over the entire secret list. Maigret had left the report lying on the table, as if he had forgotten to lock the cabinet. All day long he watched. People came and went in and out of the office, carrying files, asking casual questions. But at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Maigret heard the doorknob turn slightly, then stop. He stood still, pretending to read the documents through the frosted glass. A short, stout figure in a fedora stood for a few seconds in front of his desk. A hand moved like lightning to stuff the report into his coat. Maigret did not get up. He let him go. That evening, under the yellow lights of Pier 14, Maigret and 3 colleagues hid behind rusted containers. The sound of water lapping at the shore. The distant sound of a ship's whistle. A black car stopped. The door opened, and the administrative policeman himself, Leclerc, stepped out, holding a report. He looked around, waiting for someone to appear. Instead, flashlights came on, surrounding him on all sides. Maigret stepped out, his voice even and cold. There are no witnesses, Leclerc, it's just us and the truth you're trying to hide. Chapter 9. Confession in the Dark. Leclerc stood motionless, the flashlight beam falling on his pale face, highlighting the beads of sweat rolling down his temples. The sound of the waves was still steady, but now it sounded urgent, like a heartbeat counting down. You don't understand. Maigret, Leclerc stammered, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Try me, Maigret replied, his voice low but loud enough to make Leclerc shiver. Janvier stepped forward and snatched the report from his hand. Torrance stood behind him, blocking his escape. Lucas opened his notebook, ready to write down every word. Leclerc took a deep breath, then let it all out. Like he was exhausted, I didn't betray him for money, but because they had my daughter. A group of smugglers, they not only smuggled goods, but also collected information from within the agency. They told me to give them all the reports about the secret list. In return, the girl would be safe. Maigret narrowed his eyes. And who is that group? Leclerc swallowed, his voice almost breaking. I don't know their real names. I only know they have a leader called the Boss of the Quai Noir. He never shows himself, only gives orders through a woman. Red hair, blue eyes, a voice like a knife, named Clémence. The name was like a cold knife in Maigret's memory. He had heard it before, in a case that had never been closed in the port of Le Havre, a case where the main witness had disappeared before the trial. Where is your daughter? They keep moving. Last I heard, they were taking her to an abandoned house near the Canal Saint-Martin. Maigret turned to his group. Do not report to the office. No one else must know. We will leave now. His eyes hardened. The secret list affair was now a thin layer of fog, hiding a deeper quagmire where every step could be a trap. And the puppet masters lurked like ghosts by the river. Chapter 10. The House on the Canal. Saint-Martin. The Paris night was shrouded in a damp mist. The water of the Canal Saint-Martin, shimmering with the light of street lamps, reflected like bright knives. Maigret walked slowly along the cobbled path, his hat pulled low, his pipe long extinguished. Behind him, Janvier and Torrance followed closely. Lucas took another turn to block the back of the house. The house Leclerc had described appeared a gray mass of stone, its windows boarded up, but through the cracks a dim yellow light shone. A figure loomed behind the curtains. Maigret gave the signal. Janvier pressed his ear to the door and heard the rhythmic footsteps. Then a woman's deep, long-drawn laughter that seemed to challenge the darkness. Oh. Torrance counted softly 3, 2, 1. The door flew open. Inside, cigarette smoke mingled with the smell of strong alcohol. In the middle of the room sat a woman with her legs crossed in an armchair, her dress as dark as blood, her hair flaming in the lamplight. Her blue eyes showed no surprise at seeing Maigret. "Inspector," said Clémence, her voice smooth as velvet, but with a cold edge. "You have come at last. I have been waiting for this moment." "Where is Leclerc's daughter?" Maigret asked. Without beating around the bush, Clémence smiled, tilting her head. "Safe. As long as you play by the rules." A burly man stepped out from the corner of the room, his hand resting lightly on the butt of his gun. Lucas charged from behind, locking him in. The air was as tense as steel wire. Clémence stood up and walked slowly towards Maigret. "You don't understand. The master of the Quai Noir is not someone you can catch. He is the darkness of this city." Maigret looked straight into those eyes, knowing that any further question could spark an unstoppable chain of events. Outside, the train whistle sounded in the distance, bringing with it a cold air that cut through his skin. In an instant, he realized this was only the first door of the maze. And behind Clémence, the shadow of the master was waiting. Chapter 11. Clémence's proposal. The wind from the canal whistled through the crack in the door, swaying the oil lamp, and Clémence's shadow stretched across the wall like an ink stain. Maigret sat in the old wooden chair, his pipe still cold, his eyes fixed on the woman before him. "Sit down," he said softly, almost as an order. Clémence smiled, not obeying, but poured more wine into the crystal glass. "Do you know why I am here, Inspector? Not to hide, to wait." "Waiting for me?" Maigret asked, his voice as even as running water. "Waiting for a deal." She set her glass down on the table, leaning slightly toward him. "I will tell you the name, location, and how you can reach the boss. But..." Janvier and Torrance glanced at each other. understanding that this but could change the course of the entire case. But in return, Clémence continued, you will let me disappear. No arrest warrant. No surveillance. I will leave Paris tonight. Maigret lit his pipe. The blue-gray smoke curling around his head. And I am to trust you not to lead me into a trap. You have no choice. Clémence sipped her wine, her eyes flashing with ruthless confidence. Leclerc's daughter is in the old warehouse on the Quai Noir. If you are slow, there will be a body floating in the canal by morning. Lucas clenched his fists, but Maigret only nodded. In his head, he heard the clock count down, not to solve the case, but to keep a hostage alive. Clémence pulled a first-class train ticket from her coat and placed it on the table. This is my way out. You can follow, but if you do, the master will disappear forever. In the small room, the silence became thick, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Maigret knew this was a game where every move would be paid for in blood. Chapter 12. Quai Noir in the Mist. The Paris night was like a black velvet curtain. The fog from the canal crept between the alleys, swallowing the yellow lights. Maigret pulled up the collar of his coat, walked slowly but surely, his shoes clicking on the wet stone floor. Janvier and Lucas followed silently behind, neither of them saying a word. Everyone knew that the Quai Noir was more than just a place. It was the domain of those who would turn a disappearance into a dead body. In the distance, abandoned cranes stood like ghosts with broken necks. The sound of water lapping against the sides of old boats sounded like the whispers of unsolved crimes. They stopped in front of a warehouse with rusted iron doors and a sign so faded it was hard to read. Inside, neon lights flickered faintly each time they lit up, illuminating the silhouette of a tall man standing guard. What do we do? Sir Lucas asked softly, his hand already near the gun. Maigret looked at his watch, 11:47. He remembered what Clémence had said. If he was late, there would be a body floating in the canal tomorrow morning. He motioned for Janvier to go around behind him while he headed for the front door. With every step he took, he could feel the cold clinging to his skin and the invisible eyes watching him from the darkness. When he was less than 2 meters from the door, the guard stepped forward to block his way. His face was as hard as steel, his voice hoarse. What do you want here, Maigret? The girl. Maigret replied curtly. The guard smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Then you have come to the right place and the wrong place. There was a click behind him. Maigret knew the gun was pointed at him. Chapter 13. The Turn of the Tide. The cold gun pressed against the back of Maigret's neck, and the faint smell of gunpowder wafted in. He did not turn his head, but only tilted his eyes toward the dirty glass of the door, just enough to see Janvier's silhouette take up position behind the gunman. It's too cold to stand out here for long, Maigret said, his voice as calm as if he were inviting someone into a cafe. The guard in front of him raised his eyebrows slightly. Before he could reply, a soft crack was heard. Janvier had locked the gunman's arms, forcing him to drop his weapon. In a flash, Lucas rushed forward, grabbed the guard, and pushed him into the warehouse. The iron door slammed shut, leaving the 3 men and 2 captives in a space filled with the smell of mold and rotten wood. The neon lights were dimmed, leaving only a yellow ceiling light bulb swaying, illuminating the stacked wooden crates, each with a strange seal. Maigret walked slowly, his fingers running over the symbols on the seal, a black circle with the letter R inside. He had seen the mark in the files of an arms smuggling ring that had eluded Interpol for 3 years. From a dark corner came the sound of heavy breathing and the clanking of chains. Lucas shone his flashlight a girl, her eyes wild, her hands tied to an iron post. On the floor, a torn envelope scattered with several photos of a car accident. But Maigret immediately realized that this was no accident. It was a murder disguised. Janvier bent down to pick up the top photo. Frowning, sir. This is a picture of Etienne Larocque. Maigret looked closely, then nodded slowly. The pieces began to fit together: the disappearance, the Quai Noir, and now a direct connection to a case that had seemed closed last year. But if it was Larocque, then whoever was behind it had orchestrated it all long ago. And Maigret knew he had touched the center of a web more dangerous than he had ever thought. Chapter 14. The R Mark and the Man in the Dark. The chains clanged softly as Lucas cut the girl's bonds. The dim light illuminated her pale face, her eyes wide, as if she had just emerged from a long nightmare. They kept me 3 days, she whispered, her voice hoarse. They asked about the man with the ring with the letter R on it. Maigret sat down, his eyes darkening. You saw him. The girl nodded. It was just a shadow, but I heard a voice, hoarse, drawn out, and it smelled strongly of tobacco. Janvier and Lucas glanced at each other. Maigret was silent for a few seconds, then turned to Janvier. Call headquarters. Request a check of all files related to the Larocque case. Focus on those connected to the port of Rouen and see who wears a ring with the letter R engraved on it. As Janvier left, Maigret went to one of the crates. He used his pocket knife to pry open the lid, revealing small metal boxes, each sealed with cloth tape. He tore open a package. The smell of gunpowder hit him immediately. Lucas lowered his voice. Weapons. And this quantity can equip an entire squad of soldiers. Maigret stood tall, the yellow light casting a long shadow on the cement. We're not dealing with just one murder, Lucas. This is an operation, and the leader knows I'm after him. Outside, a train whistle echoed in the distance. The girl shivered at the sound. Every time the whistle blows, he appears, she said. Maigret suddenly understood the Quai Noir was not just a hiding place. It was a rendezvous point, and the train whistle was the signal. He turned to Lucas, his eyes flashing coldly. We'll stay this time. When the whistle blows, I want to look the man with the R in the face. Chapter 15. The Midnight Train Whistle. The harbor was shrouded in a thick fog, cold steam swirling around the yellow lampposts. Maigret leaned against a crate, his pipe glowing red in the darkness. Lucas hid behind an old crane, and the girl was carried to safety in a small warehouse a few hundred yards away. The clock read 11:57. 3 minutes to go. No one spoke. Just the gentle lapping of the waves on the concrete and the creaking of the mooring rope. Maigret could feel his heart beating, steady but heavy. Then, the train whistle sounded, long and dark, as if pulling the night closer. From the end of the dock, the shadow of a man appeared, tall, stocky. His long coat swept lightly across the floor. Under the dim light, his left hand sparkled with a ring engraved with the letter R. Maigret nodded slightly to Lucas. The two men walked out, silent but tense. You're late, said Maigret, his voice even and low. The man paused. I didn't think the police would be so patient. His lips curled, but his eyes remained cold. Maigret took a drag on his cigarette, letting the smoke out slowly. And I don't think an arms dealer would risk giving away his date every night. The figure's silhouette shook slightly in the mist. Then he suddenly turned and ran. Lucas lunged, but the man pulled out a pistol. The bullet went off loudly, sending splinters of wood flying. Maigret did not pursue immediately. He knew well the hunt had only just begun, and the R marker would lead them to the entire network. The train whistle sounded again, this time as a challenge. Chapter 16. Shadow on the Crane. Footsteps echoed on the wet concrete, mingling with the crash of waves and the distant rumble of a ship's engine. Lucas dashed after the R-marked man, while Maigret kept his distance, his eyes scanning the rows of containers stacked like walls. He circled the loading dock and followed a steel staircase up to an abandoned crane. In the flickering yellow light, he looked like a cornered stray cat. Lucas shouted, "Stop!" But all he got in response was the clanging of metal as the figure climbed higher. Maigret took his time. He noticed another figure slimmer, moving in the opposite direction, blending in between the crates. For a moment, the light reflected off a metal object in the figure's hand, a small pistol. "Lucas, watch your back," Maigret roared. A gunshot rang out immediately after. The bullet grazed the metal railing of the crane, sparks flying. Lucas dodged in time, slid down the stairs, and landed on the ground. The R-marked man stopped, breathing heavily, his eyes darting between Maigret and his companions below. Maigret advanced, his voice low but firm. "It's not just you. A network. Who's in charge?" The other chuckled hoarsely. "You will never reach him. He is here, but he is also everywhere." Just then, the ship's whistle sounded again, but this time closer, more urgent. A motorboat appeared out of the mist, its headlights scanning the dock. The man marked R jumped down from the crane, rolled across the concrete, and headed straight for the boat. Maigret understood that if he escaped this time, all clues would be lost to the waves. Chapter 17. Rushing Water and Invisible Hands. The sea breeze whipped at his face, salty and cold. The motorboat roared, accelerating, sending up white sprays. The man marked R jumped onto the deck, pulled in by two other figures. Lucas waved his hand toward the patrol boat anchored nearby. Quick, Maigret. If we let him out into the bay, we'll lose him. Maigret did not answer. He jumped into the Port Authority's rubber boat. Lucas followed. The engine roared to life. Shaking underfoot, they sped toward the other's boat, the waves crashing against its sides. Watch out! They're armed! Lucas shouted, ducking to avoid a barrage of bullets that slammed into the water, sending up dozens of sparks. Maigret didn't look down the barrel of the gun. He looked at the driver, a thin face, sharp eyes, and familiar. The blurry photo he had received a few days ago immediately came to mind, the man rumored to be a shadow broker. The man who controlled the underground connections between criminals across borders. They don't just want to run, Maigret said in a low voice. They're trying to lead us somewhere else, hiding a real rendezvous. Lucas turned back briefly, but before he could ask, another boat appeared from behind a crane, blocking the other's path of retreat. The loudspeaker boomed. Deep and gruff international police stop immediately. They swerved, ducking into a narrow passage between two container terminals, the water swirling violently. Maigret knew it was a dead end if they were fast enough. They could trap them all. But in the darkness on the shore, he saw a flashlight flash 3 times a signal. Someone on the shore was waiting for them, and Maigret knew that if he escaped up there, the whole case would disappear like ashes in the wind. Chapter 18. The Final Block. Water sprayed as Maigret and Lucas's boat turned into the narrow passage. The headlights swept across the water, catching the silhouette of the opposing boat swaying violently, trying to get past the concrete pillars of the container terminal. Lucas, left bank, close in on it. Maigret roared over the noise of the engines. Lucas pulled the wheel. Their boat pressed against the other side. The collision was so strong that both sides almost capsized. A gunman standing on the bow of the other boat staggered, almost falling into the water. In the chaos, Maigret leapt forward and grabbed the metal railing of the criminal boat. His hands were cold, but his grip was like a vice. The helmsman flinched, his cold eyes meeting Maigret's. Get off the machine. Now, Maigret hissed, his voice thick with threat. The helmsman smiled faintly, jerking his chin towards the shore, where the flashlight had flashed 3 times before. Immediately, a figure from the shore threw out an anchor rope, wrapping it tightly around the ship's pole. The opposing boat was pulled sideways, the wood creaking. Lucas jumped to his aid. In a few seconds of struggle, Maigret used his elbow to knock the gun out of the gunman's hand, causing it to fall into the swirling water. "There is no way," said Maigret, tugging at the rider's collar. "It's over." But just when he thought everything was settled, a long horn sounded from the container, and a container truck began to back down the dock. Inside, surely, was the cargo they were risking their lives to protect. Maigret turned to Lucas. "Hold these, I have to see what's in there." His footsteps echoed on the wharf, his shadow blending into the flickering yellow light, moving towards the secret that the entire line was trying to bury. Chapter 19. The secret in the container. Metal clanged as Maigret pulled on the lock on the container door. The hinges screeched, and the smell of rust mixed with something sharp and cold escaped, a smell that anyone who had been to a crime scene would recognize immediately. He switched on his flashlight. The light swept across the closed wooden crates, their surfaces blurred with fake customs markings. Maigret edged his way through the row, his hand sliding across the cold, damp surface, until the light stopped on a partially opened crate. Inside was not contraband or weapons as he had expected, but a velvet-covered chest, the brass lock ajar. Maigret opened it, and his heart seemed to stop for a beat. An ancient ivory statue, intact, surrounded by small cloth bags containing old files, yellowed papers. On the cover of one of the files was handwritten, "Dossier Fiacre, 1930. Footsteps sounded behind him. Maigret turned the flashlight, shining it on the face of Vidal, the senior police officer who had appeared to be keeping out of the situation. "You shouldn't have seen that, Maigret," Vidal said, his hand sliding slowly down to the gun hidden at his belt. His voice was tired but cold, as if he had been preparing for this moment. "So it was you," Maigret growled, his eyes never leaving Vidal's hand. "Protecting the entire network and hiding the evidence of the Saint-Fiacre affair for 20 years. Vidal curled his lips, not denying it. "Some things should be left alone. You don't understand this game, Maigret." In that tense moment, the ship's whistle sounded from afar. Lucas shouted from the dock, "Maigret, we've got them." Vidal tilted his head, his eyes flashing with determination, as if he was about to strike first. But Maigret was closer than he thought. He turned and shouldered Vidal, pushing him against the wall of the container, causing the gun to fall to the metal floor with a loud clang. "The game is up, Vidal," Maigret said, his voice steady and steady. "But this time, the one who writes the rules is me." Chapter 20. Last night in Le Havre. Port. The night wind blew across the dock from the sea, salty and cold. Maigret stepped out of the container, holding Vidal's handcuffed arm, and pushed him down the corridor of containers like a corridor of sin. Lucas and two other policemen escorted the three men who had just been arrested, who were now silent, without the aggression of a moment ago. At the end of the wharf, yellow lights reflected on the inky black water. The waves lapped gently, but could not erase the echoes of what had just happened. Maigret knew that that very night, the Paris press would carry a big headline: "Police break up antiquities smuggling ring. Saint-Fiacre mystery revealed." In the makeshift interrogation room at the dock, Maigret placed the velvet trunk on the table. He opened it in front of Vidal. "Now tell me, who is behind this?" Vidal smiled faintly, but his eyes could not hide the fatigue. "You think you have won. Maigret, this is just the tip of the iceberg. At the bottom, there are names you will never reach." "Try me," Maigret replied, his voice low but sharp. "Because every file in here, I will trace it to the end. And I will not forget. Vidal, the Saint-Fiacre affair was buried because of people like you." Vidal was silent. In the small room, only the sound of Maigret's pen signing the minutes could be heard. Each stroke was like a nail hammering into the door that closed the traitor's past. At dawn, as Vidal and his accomplices were loaded into the car, Maigret stood alone, looking out to sea. He took out his pipe and lit it. The smoke curled up, mingled with the fog, then dissipated like this case, closed on the surface but leaving behind undercurrents that he knew would linger. Lucas stepped forward. "Shall we go back to Paris, sir?" Maigret nodded. "Let's go, but don't pack too light. I think we'll need all these files, and a few sleepless nights." They left the harbor as dawn tinged the water with gold. In the distance, the sound of ships echoed, a reminder that the game of light and shadow never really ended. Part 2. Opening chapter. The Mist on the Seine, Paris. A late autumn morning. A thick gray fog blanketed the Seine, turning the bridges into floating shadows. Maigret stood by his office window, his pipe long since extinguished, but still between his lips. He had just returned from Le Havre last night. The Vidal dossier was still on his desk, papers in disarray, interspersed with a few black and white photographs of the confiscated artifacts. But what troubled him most was not the artifacts, but the old dossier with the faded inscription Saint-Fiacre. There was a soft knock on the door. Lucas entered, a sealed envelope in his hand. Express. From the post this morning. No return address. Maigret opened the letter, and inside was a blurry photograph, a scene from the living room of the old Saint-Fiacre mansion. Sitting in the host's chair was not the victim, but a strange man, wearing a light-colored suit, looking straight into the camera lens. Below the photo was a scrawled line, "He is still alive." Maigret said nothing. He just reached for his coat and buttoned it slowly. Lucas, get the car ready. We have a long and cold ride. The mist outside seemed to thicken. Paris was immersed in the humid breath of autumn, and Maigret knew that this hunt would not only reach Vidal, but also drag him down to the bottom of a secret that had been buried for more than 10 years. Chapter 2. The Gatekeeper of Montargis. The car left Paris early in the morning. The fog was so thick it seemed to swallow the road. Maigret sat quietly in the back seat, his eyes following the fading light of the street lamps. In his pocket, the photo and the words, "He is still alive," were like cold lead. Lucas drove, watching the road and glancing at the rearview mirror. "Sir, who do you think sent the photo?" Maigret just shook his head slightly. "Someone who wants us to believe, or someone who wants us to fall into a trap." It was still dark when we arrived at Montargis. The road leading to the Villa Saint-Fiacre was blocked by a high iron gate, its paint peeling. Behind it were rows of bare trees like dry bones. A tall, thin man in a woolen cloak stood as still as a statue by the gate. His face was half in shadow. Maigret stepped down, took out his police badge. But before he could speak, the man spoke hoarsely. You came for the photo. Lucas tightened his grip on the gun. Maigret remained calm, his eyes never leaving the other. Who are you, the gatekeeper? But not of this place, but of a story that you thought was over. The wind blew through the crack in the gate, carrying with it the musty smell of earth and rotten wood. The man pulled another envelope from his shirt and threw it through the iron slot. Inside is the name of the man you seek. But if you open it, you will not be able to return. Maigret did not reply. He bent down to pick up the envelope, feeling the tension in the air. In the distance, the church bells rang, deep and long, as if signaling a beginning or an end. Chapter 3. The Name in the Envelope. Maigret sat in the small cafe on the corner of Montargis Street, his coffee steaming slightly in front of him. He placed the envelope on the table, his finger slowly running along the edge, as if weighing whether to open it or leave it as is. Keeping the secret a little longer, Lucas sat opposite, his eyes anxious. Boss, if this is a trap, the sooner you open it, the better. Maigret just took a sip of coffee, then tore open the envelope. Inside was a small piece of paper, handwritten in slanted, faded blue ink. Henri Vautrin, Hôtel des Cygnes, Orléans. Henri Vautrin. The name brought back to Maigret's mind a report from 10 years ago, the Saint-Fiacre affair. Shady broker who disappeared soon after the case was closed. No one could find him then, and the file simply noted, probably died in Belgium. Lucas frowned. If he's alive, that means the whole old file is in trouble. Not just trouble, Maigret replied, his voice low. But someone has been trying to keep it quiet. Outside the window, fog still swirled around the street lamps. Maigret took out a cigarette and lit it. The flare reflected in his eyes, a light not so much of a burning cigarette as of a rekindled investigative instinct. We will go to Orléans, he said, rising, but not by the main road, and without anyone knowing. At the counter, the waitress glanced at them for a moment, then turned away. Only when the two of them left the restaurant did she quietly pick up the phone, dial a number, and whisper. He opened the envelope. Chapter 4. Hôtel des Cygnes. Orléans greeted Maigret on a damp afternoon. It was not raining, but the cobblestone streets were slippery, and the musty smell of the Loire clung to his collar. Lucas walked beside him, his hands thrust deep into his coat pockets, his eyes darting from side to side at the passing figures. The Hotel des Cygnes stood alone at the end of a small street, its white sign yellowed. Inside, the reception desk was deserted. A gray-haired woman stepped out, her voice hoarse. "Do you need a room?" Sir, Maigret smiled, showed a fake business card, and introduced himself as Monsieur Charles, merchant from Paris. They rented 2 separate rooms on the second floor when he received the keys. Maigret asked vaguely, "Is Henri Vautrin still here?" The woman's eyes widened for a moment. Then she immediately became calm again. "I don't know who you are talking about." After the door closed, Lucas said in a low voice, "She obviously knows." Maigret nodded slightly, opened his suitcase, and took out a small notebook. "We won't find Vautrin by asking. We'll let him reveal himself." In the evening, they went down to the hotel restaurant. Only a few tables had customers, unfamiliar faces, but in the corner of the room, a man in a felt hat and an old ash-gray coat sat with his back turned. Whenever the staff passed by, he bowed his head slightly, avoiding the light. Maigret pretended not to notice, but his every move was calculated. He ordered a bottle of red wine, poured it slowly, and glanced occasionally at the wall mirror, where the other man's image was clearer. The gaunt face, the sparse mustache, and the eyes hidden behind round glasses. There was no mistaking it. Henri Vautrin. Lucas started to stand, but Maigret stopped him with a shake of his head. "Not yet. Let him think we don't recognize him." Outside, the river wind began to blow hard, and from somewhere a ship's whistle drifted in. In that moment, Maigret knew the real game had begun, and every next step could lead them to the truth or a deadly dead end. Chapter 5. Darkness by the river bank. Night had fallen over Orléans like a thick curtain. The streets around the Hotel des Cygnes were bathed in a faint yellow light, which reflected off the wet stones. Maigret and Lucas's boots echoed softly as they followed Henri Vautrin, who had left the restaurant less than 5 minutes before. Vautrin walked quickly, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, his head bowed. as if he wanted to fade into the shadows. He crossed a narrow alley and turned onto the main road that ran along the banks of the Loire. Maigret kept far enough away to avoid being noticed, but close enough to hear the sound of his hurried footsteps mixed with the wind. Lucas whispered, "He is trying to get rid of him." Maigret nodded slightly. "And that is when we have to be more patient than him." At the abandoned pier, Vautrin stopped. He lit a cigarette, took a deep drag, and glanced around. From behind a pile of crates, a second figure emerged, tall, darkly scarfed, his face hidden by a hood. They exchanged a few short words. Maigret did not hear clearly, but in the light of the street lamp, he saw that the stranger's hand held a thick envelope. Vautrin took it, stuffed it into his vest, and turned away. "Money or papers," Lucas guessed quietly. Maigret remained silent, his eyes fixed on Vautrin's figure disappearing into the night. The other man stood alone on the riverbank, lighting a new cigarette, as if waiting for someone else. Maigret decided to step out. "A fine evening for a walk, isn't it?" he said, his voice low and calm. The other man was startled, but quickly regained his composure. "I don't know you. You will?" Maigret replied, taking a step forward so that the light could better illuminate his face. A long scar ran down his left cheek. A cold wind blew, and Maigret knew this moment was the turning point. Either he would run away, or he would reveal a secret that would take the whole case in a completely different direction. Chapter 6: Under the Smoke. The man with the scar took a deep drag on his cigarette, blowing the smoke out in rings, as if to stall for time. Maigret stood less than a meter away, his hand resting lightly in his coat pocket where his pistol was always ready. "How long have you known Vautrin?" Maigret asked, his voice even and without a trace of harshness. The other man smirked. Vautrin, "Just a second-hand dealer. I buy a few things and resell them to make a living. Not illegal." "So what's in the envelope?" "It can't be an antique shop receipt." "You were following me." His voice became hard, but his eyes glanced to the right, where the lights from the pier reflected on the water. Maigret slowly lit his pipe, letting the smoke drift into the space between them. "In my line of work, surveillance is necessary, especially when the victim was shot dead just 2 streets away. and you appear in secret conversation with my main witness. The scar creased as he frowned. He stubbed out his cigarette on the edge of the wooden bridge and put it in his pocket, as if to erase the trace. What do you want? The truth. If you don't tell me here, we'll tell you at the station. He was silent for a few seconds, then sighed, his eyes glancing around as if afraid someone might hear. Okay, but you didn't hear this from me, Vautrin. He doesn't just deal in used goods. He takes and delivers things the police don't want floating around the streets. Forged papers, sometimes guns. Maigret inclined his head, the smoke from his pipe curling in faint tendrils in the lamplight. And tonight, he received a photo. A photo is enough to make a person disappear. Maigret felt the veins in his temples swell. This was no longer a simple murder. It was part of a power game where a photograph could kill more effectively than any bullet. Chapter 7. Night in the Rue des Capucines. The rain was falling like silver threads, sliding down the walls of the old house on the Rue des Capucines. Maigret stood, huddled under the narrow eaves, his coat shoulders soaked, his eyes glued to the third-floor window where Vautrin rented a room. A faint yellow light still shone through the curtains. The pocket watch showed that it was almost midnight. The street was almost deserted, except for the sound of water dripping from the gutters onto the pavement and the faint sound of footsteps in the distance. Maigret knew that he had only one chance. If Vautrin had hidden the photograph elsewhere, it would all slip through his fingers like pipe smoke in the night wind. He approached the front door, the rusty lock clicking softly as the master key turned. Inside, the smell of mold and tobacco hung heavy over him. The wooden stairs creaked under each step, but the rain drowned it out. Third floor. Vautrin's door was ajar. Maigret pushed it open, heard the hinges groan, and entered. The room was dim, the only light coming from a small table lamp that illuminated a mess of papers. An empty bottle of wine lay on the floor. Next to it, a wet coat Vautrin had just returned. On the table, beneath an old newspaper, a brown envelope was sticking out of the edge. Maigret pulled it out, his heart beating faster. Inside was a black and white photograph. A woman's face, her eyes staring straight at him. The face was familiar. Too familiar. There was a slight creaking of the wooden floorboards behind him. Maigret turned. Vautrin stood in the doorway, a small gun glinting with metal in his hand. "Put it down, Maigret," he said, his voice hoarse but cold. "You don't understand. This picture, if it leaves here, will drag us all down." Maigret did not blink, still holding the photograph in his hand. Outside, the rain was still falling, but inside the room, the atmosphere was as thick as if it could break. Chapter 8. The Man Behind the Photo. The gun in Vautrin's hand shook slightly, but his eyes did not. Maigret remained where he was, clutching the photograph. The yellow light of the table lamp fell on Vautrin's face, revealing deep wrinkles and tired eyes as if he had been awake many nights. "Who is she?" Maigret asked, his voice low, as if to pierce through the other's defenses. "The only person to whom I owe my life, and the only person I cannot betray," Vautrin replied, his eyes never leaving the photograph. Maigret lowered the photograph slightly, as if to encourage him to continue. Outside the window, a car passed, its tires churning up the water. For a moment, the lights flickered and stabilized. "If you take her to the station, everything will collapse. Not just me, not just her, but people you don't know. Maigret, do you think this case is about a small murder?" His voice lowered, almost to a whisper. "This is about a network, a hand controlling from the shadows." Maigret slipped the photograph into his coat pocket, a deliberate gesture of defiance. "I don't care about any network, Vautrin. I only care about who killed Lefebvre." Vautrin laughed dryly, the laugh of one who has gone too far to turn back. "Do you think Lefebvre died because of a petty debt for wine? No. He died because he knew this secret. And if you dig a little deeper, you will end up on the same path." The rain outside grew louder, like a drum beating into the tense atmosphere. Maigret kept his eyes on him, but in his mind, a new piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This was not a simple case, and the woman in the photograph was the key. A car horn sounded at the end of the street. Vautrin glanced out the window, then quickly turned and disappeared down the dark hallway, leaving the door swinging and the faint smell of gunpowder in the air. Maigret stood alone in the empty room, his hand unconsciously tightening around the photograph. He knew now The case had gone far beyond the boundaries of a normal investigation. Chapter 9. The Woman in the Mist. The next morning, Paris was shrouded in a thin fog, as if the city were trying to hide its secrets. Maigret left the small cafe on Rue de Rivoli with his espresso still hot in his hand, his eyes on an old building across the street where, according to an anonymous source, the woman in the photo once lived. The heavy wooden door opened after 3 knocks. A thin old woman with ashen hair poked her head out. "Who are you looking for?" "I want to ask about someone who was here." "About 3 years ago." Dark hair, tall, eyes, very special. She frowned, then glanced around, as if afraid someone might be listening. "You're talking about Clara. But you'd better forget that name." Maigret leaned slightly, lowering his voice. "Do you know where she is?" "Nobody knows. She disappeared one winter night with a suitcase and a man in a gray coat. They say he came from across the border." A cold wind blew into the corridor, carrying with it the smell of damp and the faint scent of Gaulois cigarettes. Maigret frowned. What did this mean across the border? An organization, a smuggling ring, or something even darker. He walked out into the street, his mind reeling with fragmented clues. As he passed an old photo studio, he paused. In a dusty glass case, among the faded wartime photographs, there was a faded photograph. Clara was standing next to Lefebvre, their hands touching meaningfully. The shop door opened with a tinkling bell. The proprietor, an old man with eyes as deep as coal pits, looked at Maigret and spoke first. "You came for that picture, didn't you? But if I were you, I would let it go. Every person who touched her disappeared or died." Maigret did not reply. He bought the photograph, put it in his pocket, and stepped out into the street. The fog had thickened, swallowing his silhouette. It was clear now. Clara was not just a witness. She was at the heart of the crime, and, perhaps, of a conspiracy that had ensnared those who thought they were in control. Chapter 10. The Stalker in the Rain. The rain began to fall as Maigret left the studio. The first drops were light, then quickly heavy, beating rhythmically on the cobblestones. Paris was covered in a veil of water, everything blurred. Yellow lights dappled on the wet pavement. He buttoned up his coat collar and walked slowly toward the avenue. His professional habit made him unable to help but notice the sound of footsteps behind him. Steady, not too close, but close enough to synchronize with his own. Maigret turned into a small alley, narrow and dark, lit only by a flickering street lamp. He stopped at the door of an old tavern and saw in the frosted glass the reflection of a figure in a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat, standing at the entrance of the alley. He pushed open the door of the bar and entered a thick smell of liquor and cigarette smoke. A few men were playing cards in the corner. Heads bowed. Maigret chose a table near the window, ordered a calvados, and kept his eyes on the shadow outside. He did not enter, but he did not leave either. When his glass was empty, he stood up, leaving the bar. Maigret walked deliberately fast through the small, labyrinthine streets. The footsteps continued to follow, sometimes near, sometimes far, as if the other person wanted him to know he was being followed, but did not intend to reveal himself. At the Place des Vosges, Maigret stopped suddenly and turned around. No one was there. There was only the sound of the rain, the wind whistling through the leafless trees, and a few umbrellas passing hurriedly by. He reached into his pocket, his fingers touching Clara's photograph. At that moment, a black Citroën came around the corner, screeching to a halt beside him. The window rolled down, revealing a stranger with cold eyes, Inspector Maigret. If you want to live long, stop looking for her. The car disappeared into the rain before he could react. Only the sound of the engine fading away remained. And in Maigret's mind, the words echoed like a warning or a challenge. Chapter 11, Riverside Coffee Shop. The next morning, the rain was still falling, as if Paris did not want to wake up. Maigret sat by the window of his study, a steaming cup of coffee, holding in his hand the photograph of Clara he had looked at until he knew every detail. Those eyes, sad and defiant, were now his only guide. A phone call from a source he knew at the Quai des Orfèvres made him jump. Clara will probably be at a cafe on the Seine, near the Pont Sully, this afternoon, the voice said softly, as if afraid someone would overhear. Who told you? I don't know. Anonymous message. But listen, Inspector. They say you're alone. Maigret hung up, a chill running down his spine. Going alone, that meant either they wanted him to see the truth, or they wanted him to never come back. The Café Le Pont Perdu was nestled under an old porch, its walls stained yellow. Inside, yellow lights shone on tired faces. He chose a table near the window, from where he could see the gray river and the Sully Bridge in the mist. 15 minutes passed. He pretended to read the paper, but his eyes never left the door. Then a figure appeared, a beret pulled low, a long brown cloak, walking slowly and hesitantly. Clara. She paused in front of the shop, her eyes darting quickly inside, as if considering whether to enter. Maigret raised his hand, but immediately noticed something unusual. A man in a black leather jacket was standing on the corner, clearly watching her. It wasn't the stalker from last night, but his gaze was just as cold. Clara entered. She sat down at the table opposite Maigret, took off her hat. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. "You shouldn't have come looking for me," she whispered. "Then who will you're being hunted? Last night, someone told me to give up." She pursed her lips, glanced out the window. The man in the leather jacket was gone. "Inspector, this matter is bigger than you think. If I speak, someone will die. If I stay silent, I will die first." Before Maigret could ask more, there was a screech of brakes outside. A figure rushed into the cafe, slid past the tables, threw a white envelope in front of him, and disappeared like the wind. Clara trembled. They have begun. Maigret opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph of him, taken through the window of his apartment last night. Chapter 12. The shadow behind the lens. Maigret held the photograph tightly, his eyes scanning the hazy details, the office window, the pale yellow light of the desk lamp, his silhouette leaning over the file. The angle was high, very high. That is, the photographer was not standing on the street, but facing it, with a direct view of his apartment. He looked up, but Clara was gone from the table. Her coffee was steaming. Her chair was still warm, but the cafe door was only shaking slightly in the wind. She left without a word. Maigret stood up and walked quickly out into the street. The rain was coming down hard. He looked at the building across from his apartment, in his mind a block of gray concrete. The top floor with windows opening onto a small balcony. He knew that if he found that room, he would find the person who had been following him. Late in the afternoon, Maigret entered the building. The hallway was dark. The smell of mold and stale cigarettes clinging to the walls. He made his way to the 7th floor. The door to room 7B was ajar. A wisp of cigarette smoke drifting out. He pushed the door open gently. Inside, the room was almost empty, save for a wooden table, a large camera on a tripod, and a stack of photographs strewn across the table. He picked them up, of himself, of Clara, of secret meetings in bars, even of moments when he thought he was alone, all taken from a distance. Through long lenses, on the wall, a map of Paris was marked with red pins. Many of the pins were clustered around the locations he had visited during the case. In the corner of the map, a handwritten note read, "Eyes open, mouth closed." Maigret turned back to the window, his eyes fixed on his apartment across the river. There, the desk lamp was still on, but he knew full well that he was not at home. A noise behind him. He turned, but too late. A dark figure appeared in the doorway, holding a small pistol. "Inspector, you've seen too much." Chapter 13. Gunshots in the hallway. Maigret did not blink. The gun looked small, but the hand holding it was steady as a rock. The shadow tilted its head slightly, and the light from the hallway fell on its face, a man in his 40s, with slicked back hair and a gaze both calm and cold. "You know more than you should, Inspector," he said, his voice hoarse but clear. Maigret tried to keep his voice even. "Then why not tell me who hired you to spy on me?" He curled his lips, not answering. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the window, accompanied by the sound of rain hitting the glass. Maigret glanced quickly at the table. The distance was only a little more than 3 steps, but the gun did not allow him to take another step. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. He turned his head reflexively. Maigret took advantage of the moment to rush towards the table. knocking away the camera tripod. The large lens fell, hitting the floor with a loud bang. The gun went off, the bullet lodged in the wall right next to Maigret's ear. The man who entered the corridor was a thin old man carrying a bucket of water, who was horrified by the sight before him. He cursed, backed away, and rushed out the back door. Maigret was about to follow, but a second shot rang out, this time from the stairs below. As a warning, when he reached the railing and looked down, the stairs were empty. There was only the sound of the ground floor door banging loudly and then silence. Back in the room, Maigret found an envelope lying near the foot of the table. Inside were 3 more photographs, all of Clara, but in places he had never seen her before. One at the train station, one at a dark riverside, and one standing next to a man in a long overcoat, his face obscured by shadows. The corner of the photo has a handwritten caption, "Last appointment, night of the 5th. Maigret stuffed the envelope into his pocket, feeling that this case had just entered a new, dangerous level, where he was not only the investigator, but the target. Chapter 14. Night of the 5th. The rain had stopped, but Paris was still as wet as if someone had washed it with a giant bucket. The puddles on the pavement reflected the flickering streetlights, creating yellow stains. Maigret walked slowly, his coat collar turned up, his hand clutching the envelope in his pocket. The night of the 5th, less than an hour to go. The riverbank in the photo is in the outskirts of the district, where the lights are dim and the damp smell of trash and moss permeates the air. He arrived early. Standing by an old lamp-post, Maigret watched silently. The river flowed silently, black. In the distance, the late-night train whistle echoed, vaguely like the call of another world. The first figure appeared from the left bank, a tall, thin woman in a scarf. Clara. She walked quickly, carrying a small bag, looking back now and then, as if afraid someone was following her. Maigret stepped back into the shadows, his heart beating slowly but strongly. A few minutes later, a black car stopped at the entrance of the alley leading down to the dock. A man in a long overcoat stepped out of the car. His wide-brimmed hat hid most of his face. Without looking around, he walked straight to Clara. exchanged a few brief words, then offered her his hand to help her into the car. Maigret was about to step out when a slight noise behind him made him stop. Another figure, smaller, was watching everything from the opposite side. Not Clara's side. The gaze was too sharp and cold. The car started, its headlights sweeping across the river and disappearing to the east. The shadowy figure left soon after, disappearing into the night as if it had never existed. Maigret went to the riverbank where Clara had been standing. On the ground, he saw a small piece of paper, wet and stuck to the water. When he pulled it apart, a scribbled message appeared. Trust no one, not even the police. A chill ran down his spine. The rendezvous on the night of the 5th was not the end. It was the beginning of a game of prey, and Maigret was not sure which part he was playing. Chapter 15. The Black Car. Maigret was in no hurry to leave the dock. He stood for a few minutes, letting the cool wind and the smell of the river wash away his turbid thoughts. The sound of the water lapping against the quay reminded him that everything that had just happened was real, not an illusion. As he turned to leave, he had a plan. The night watchman at the gas station at the end of the street recognized any strange car. Maigret went to him, lit his pipe, and struck up a conversation as if he were just a passer-by, warming himself by the coals. The black citron. Yes, I see. The night watchman nodded. The number plates are a bit old and dusty. They filled up with gas and asked for directions to Highway 4. Highway 4, towards the suburbs, where darkness swallowed up all sounds. Maigret thanked him, left a cigar, and stepped out into the street to catch a night taxi. Stick to that path. No need to be fast. Just don't lose sight of it, he said. The wind blew through the half-open window, carrying the smell of metal and wet asphalt. The car lights flickered like flickering flames against the gray sky. About 20 minutes later, they saw the citron in the distance. It turned onto a dirt road, hidden among the bare trees. Maigret signaled for the lights to stop, then got out and walked along the red tail lights. The road led to a detached villa, its iron gate ajar. The citron stopped in the yard. A man got out first and opened the door for Clara. Maigret hid behind a tree, watching. When the door closed, He realized that there was no light from inside. The house was in darkness, except for a second-floor window that had just opened, revealing a hand trembling, dropping a white handkerchief stained with mud. Maigret bent down to pick it up and brought it to his nose. The strange scent of perfume mixed with the smell of iron made him frown slightly. This was not just a secret meeting, it was a cry for help, delivered right into his hands. Chapter 16. Darkness in the Mansion. Maigret did not rush in. He stood still in the shade of the trees, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The rusty iron gate creaked in the wind, a gentle warning. He tried a gentle push. The gate opened without resistance. The cobblestone path led straight to the front door. But Maigret circled around to the side, avoiding the dim light from the porch. His wet boots made each step heavier, but he kept his breathing even. The ground floor was silent. The windows closed. Only on the second floor. The same window was still open a crack. From there came a smell cheap cigarette smoke, which did not match the appearance of this villa. He found a side door at the back. The lock was old, and with a slight push, the latch swung open. Maigret slipped in, closing the door behind him. The interior was cold, as if the fireplace had never been lit. The kitchen came into view. First, the dining table was covered with a thin layer of dust. The cups were scattered, but there was a freshly washed knife on the sink, dripping with water. He touched the blade. It was still warm. Someone had been here. A slight noise from the wooden stairs made Maigret stop breathing. A figure was moving slowly, as if groping each step. He pressed himself against the wall, drew his pistol, and felt the cold metal in his hand. The footsteps stopped. Then a hoarse whisper echoed down, "Don't make a noise." He's listening. Maigret looked up at the bottom of the stairs. Stood Clara, her eyes wide with panic. A red line ran down her cheeks to her chin, but before he could move forward, there was a click behind him. The door had been locked. Someone knew he was here. And they just turned this mansion into a trap. Chapter 17. The Sound of Keys in the Dark. Maigret did not turn immediately. He listened. In the darkness, the sounds spread further. The key turned in the metal lock. The tumbler of the lock clicked. Then silence. Clara's figure at the bottom of the stairs trembled. She wanted to say something, but her eyes darted quickly toward the corridor behind Maigret, a silent warning. He glanced again at the kitchen knives, table, and a dark shadow slid through the doorway, as quick as a knife cutting through cloth. Maigret took a step forward. Pistol raised. "Get out," he said, his voice low and even. No one answered. Only the dripping sound of the faucet mingled with the pounding of his heart in his chest. Maigret decided not to pursue the shadow, but slowly back toward the stairs, his eyes never leaving the darkness. As he stepped onto the second step, a faint hiss sounded in his ear. The rope brushed past his face. Maigret ducked in time, smelling the singed rope. A trap. Clara rushed down the steps, grabbed his arm, and whispered, "There's not much time left. He's in the basement." Basement. Maigret paused. The small door under the stairs opened into a dark slit, and from it a musty smell mixed with something fishy, like old metal or blood. Rose. He gently pushed Clara back, pointing the gun at the darkness. From deep within the darkness, a man's voice rang out, slow and drawn out. "You've got the wrong man, Maigret." And then the ceiling lights went out. The entire mansion was plunged into darkness. Chapter 18. Breath in the Darkness. The darkness was like a thick liquid, swallowing all forms. Maigret stood still for a few seconds, letting his ears do the work of his eyes. Breathing deep, deliberately rhythmic, came from the basement. He walked step by step, tiptoeing as if the floor might cave in at any moment. The smell of damp, metallic air grew stronger, bringing with it memories of damp morgues in past cases. When his hand touched the basement doorknob, the metal was cold. His breathing stopped. Then there was a click, like someone had placed something heavy on the cement floor. Maigret pushed open the door, leaving the light on, so that the dim light from the hallway shone down on each step. Each step made a creaking sound, as if to warn those below of his approach. In the middle of the basement stood a shadowy shape covered with a dirty tarpaulin. On the floor, a dark water trail led from the stairs to it. He gently pulled back the tarpaulin. Underneath was a wooden chest with a new iron lock and mud all around. Just as Maigret bent down to examine it, a chilling hiss sounded behind him, the sound of a knife blade sliding through a sheath. He turned, gun raised. But instead of a fierce face, he saw Clara standing trembling, holding a kitchen knife in her hand, her lips moving. "You don't understand. If you open it, it will all be over." Maigret narrowed his eyes. "And for whom?" She didn't answer. Instead, a wooden panel burst open from the wall, and a strange arm reached out, reaching for the chest. Chapter 19. The Man in the Wall. In that brief moment, everything happened at once. Clara stepped back, knife still in hand, her eyes wide open, not because of fear of Maigret, but because of fear of whatever was behind the wall. The other arm, sinewy and muddy, groped at the chest. Maigret switched on the flashlight, and the beam swept through the cracks in the wood. A face emerged, gaunt, with eyes like coal holes, and the naked gaze of someone driven to the limit. "Back off," Maigret said, his voice low, but heavy as lead. Clara stood frozen, her knife blade trembling. The man in the wall growled softly, then withdrew completely, revealing himself as a small, agile figure, slipping through the narrow space as if he belonged there. He did not run up the stairs. He darted into a low hatch beneath the wooden shelf, disappearing into the pitch blackness. Maigret did not dismiss her immediately. He looked at Clara, still holding the flashlight close to her face. "You have two choices. Tell me everything now, or I will let that man disappear and take you instead." Clara swallowed, her hand on the knife slowly lowering. "You don't understand. He's not the killer, but he knows who is. And if you catch him, you'll never find out." The words, instead of dispelling his doubts, only sent a chill down Maigret's spine. He closed his gun, but his eyes remained fixed on the dark cellar door, where answers, and perhaps even greater dangers, awaited. Chapter 20. Underground. Maigret descended the narrow steps, his leather shoes creaking against the rotten wood. The cold, damp air filled his lungs, carrying with it the smell of rusted metal and something acrid, like rotten roots. The flashlight beam swept across the mud wall, where there were fresh scratches and crumbs of dirt falling to the floor. Ahead, the sound of hurried bare feet echoed, then stopped. Maigret bent down and discovered a mud print in the shape of a small, splayed foot, the foot of someone who had lived long in the dark, without shoes. The tunnel wound down into a wide opening, the ceiling so low that he had to crouch. In the middle was a rough-hewn wooden table, littered with yellowed papers, maps, and faded photographs. Maigret recognized some of the faces in the pictures, people who had given statements to the police. And one of them was the victim. A gasp came from the dark corner. Maigret flashed his flashlight. Those eyes appeared again, glinting like those of a cornered animal. But this time, there was something else. His hand was clutching a small piece of paper, trembling. "Give it to me," Maigret said, his voice low. The other shook his head, retreating into the shadows. "If you knew, you would die like them." The flashlight's light flickered, revealing a crack in the dirt wall behind him, deep and dark, as if it led to another tunnel. And Maigret understood this was more than just a hiding place. This was a network, a door opening onto a buried secret. He took another step and realized he had crossed the line set by the original case. Now, the game had changed. Chapter 21. Breath in the darkness, Maigret raised his hand, silencing all sounds. There were no more running footsteps, only the steady drip of water echoing from somewhere in the tunnel. He bent down and picked up a half-burnt match. Someone had lit it recently to see where he was going. The crack opened into a low passage, so narrow that his shoulders scraped against the cold earthen walls. The smell of dampness was thick, mixed with the pungent scent of fungus growing on rotten wood. The flashlight beam could only illuminate a few meters, but in the darkness ahead, Maigret could make out a white vapor, puffing and then vanishing, the breath of someone waiting. "Get out," he said softly but sharply. No answer, only a deep, slow breath, as if trying to calm himself. Maigret took a step forward. The flashlight flashed, and the light reflected off a white, expressionless porcelain mask, revealing only the eyes. "You're too early, Maigret," the hoarse voice said behind the mask. "I haven't finished cleaning yet." Behind him, the tunnel opened into a small room with damp brick walls. On the table was a map of the entire neighborhood, drawn in red pencil. Several houses were marked with X's, including the building where the murder had begun. Maigret knew at once this was the command center, and the man before him was the last link he needed. But there was something else that made him shiver even more in the corner of the room. Neatly placed was an old suitcase, half open. Inside were secret police files, the kind that only a few people were allowed to touch. The masked man tilted his head to one side, as if invitingly. If you come in, everything will be different. Both the truth and your fate. Maigret took a deep breath, feeling the cold of the earth seep into his veins. He was close to the edge, just one step away from throwing everything into the wind. Chapter 22. The Masked Man. Maigret stood motionless, the flashlight still shining on the cold porcelain. Their breaths mingled in the humid air of the cellar, but his heart beat faster. He could not rush, because any wrong move would turn this place into a closed trap. Take off your mask, Maigret said, his voice low and slow, almost hypnotic. A soft chuckle rang out. No, Inspector, if you saw my face, you would recognize too much, and you wouldn't be able to pretend you never knew. The flashlight beam swept across the table where the map lay open, its red pencil lines overlapping like veins. Maigret realized the markers were not just crime scenes, they matched the smuggling routes he had followed years ago. This couldn't be a coincidence. You have 1 minute to tell me why I found these files here. Maigret pointed to the suitcase. Before I call someone down and turn you into an anonymous corpse in the minutes. The masked man leaned over, a glint of amusement in his eyes. Because, Maigret, one of your men left them here. I'm just their custodian. For now. The air thickened for a moment. Maigret saw more clearly the cracks in the system he had believed so solid. If he was telling the truth, this involved not only underground crime, but also a traitor within the ranks of the police. Name. Maigret growled, "Oh no." He took a step back, holding up his hand. The name will come to you in time, if you will give me what I want in exchange. What is that? Safety guaranteed. A ticket out of France? And a promise that you will burn everything you see tonight. Maigret looked deep into the eyes behind the mask. They were not the frightened eyes of a desperate man. but the eyes of a fox who knew he still held the dagger hidden under his shirts. Chapter 23. The Trap in the Promise. Maigret did not answer immediately. He took a drag on his cigarette, letting the smoke swirl around his head, hiding his calculating eyes. Each word he spoke was like a piece placed on a chessboard, and if he made the wrong move, the board would collapse. Very well, said Maigret, his voice unreadable. I can arrange a safe passage, but it will take time. You must leave me something to ensure that my efforts are not wasted. The masked man tilted his head. A hostage. Is it? Or a secret? The name, Maigret said, each word seeming to tap the air. The name of the man in the force who helped you. I want it now. He laughed, a laugh that seemed to echo in the cramped cellar. He's in your coat pocket, Maigret. Maigret frowned slightly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old, faded envelope. He was sure he had never seen it before. Inside was a folded piece of paper with the words scrawled across it. Look at your messenger. His heart skipped a beat. The messenger. There was only one person who fit that description in this case, a young, energetic policeman whom Maigret trusted implicitly to carry information between himself and headquarters. Maigret kept his face as cold as ice. If I agree, what will you give me in exchange? He pulled a small black steel key from his pocket and placed it gently on the table. When you find its lock, everything will be clear, and you will understand why I had to leave. Maigret nodded, as if accepting the terms, but in his mind, every detail had been arranged into a plan that, with just one step, would never let him escape. Chapter 24. The Shadow in the Hallway. Maigret stepped out of the cellar, the black steel key tucked into his pocket, heavy as a curse. The damp corridor leading to the surface was lit by pale yellow light from old bulbs. But the darkness in every corner seemed to swallow every sound. He didn't turn around, but he could feel the masked man's gaze on him from the shadows, a gaze that was both challenging and inviting, as if to say, see how well you can keep up with me. As the iron door slammed behind him, Maigret signaled to the two waiting policemen. No one is to touch him, he said quietly, but his voice was sharp. Let him believe he is free. Outside, The city's night mist covered everything in a thin mist, making the street lights appear hazy. Maigret turned into the narrow street and walked quickly toward the waiting car. In the car, Lucas, his longtime assistant, looked at him quizzically. "What do we do now, sir?" Maigret sat down in his chair, staring into space. "We will not take him tonight. We will take the man he has just given us." Lucas frowned. "What do you mean?" Maigret pulled an envelope from his pocket and tossed it onto the chair beside him. Lucas opened it, read the brief words, and froze. "Oh my, it can't be." "Perhaps," Maigret interrupted. "And if you remember, he is the only one who knows every route I have taken in the past week. Tonight, you will play the role of involuntary messenger, and we will see who comes to receive the news." The car started and rolled through the deserted streets. In the darkness, Maigret saw more clearly than ever the real prey was not in the cellar, but hiding among his own ranks. Chapter 25. Appointment in the Mist. Night had passed, but the city still held its breath. The fog was thicker, hugging the yellow streetlights, reducing visibility to just a few meters. Lucas leaned against the electric pole, holding the envelope in his hand, his shoulders shaking slightly, whether from cold or excitement. Maigret was not near. He hid in the shadows on the other side of the street, where the light could not reach. The tobacco smoke from his pipe curled into thin ribbons, dissolved and swallowed by the mist. Footsteps echoed softly from the end of the alley, not hurried, not slow, the steady pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going. A silhouette gradually emerged, a thin figure in a long overcoat. The collar turned up to cover half of his face. Lucas clenched the envelope in his hand. The man stopped in front of him, not saying a word, just holding out a hand covered in a black leather glove. "Here you go," Lucas said, his voice steady. He held out the envelope, but didn't let go. The other man raised his head, and Lucas recognized the eyes. Those eyes cold, calculating, and so familiar it made his heart clench. From the shadows, Maigret stepped forward, his voice low and firm. "Bonsoir, Inspector Dupré." The other man paused. For a moment, everything was silent. except for the sound of dew falling on the tin roof. You followed me? Dupre asked, his voice hoarse. No, Maigret replied, taking a step forward. I just let you lead yourself here. Lucas stepped back, allowing their gazes to meet. Dupre clutched the envelope, as if weighing the options of flight or attack. But Maigret spoke first. Inside that envelope is an arrest warrant for you. Charges conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and murder. Dupre smiled coldly, but his eyes showed surprise. The mist seemed to thicken, wrapping them into an inescapable landscape. Chapter 26. The Chase in the Rain. Shadow. Dupre did not reply. For just a moment, his body tilted slightly, then turned and shot away like an arrow through thick fog. Lucas to the left, Maigret shouted, his voice echoing in the night. Lucas followed, but Dupre's shoes seemed accustomed to the slippery cobblestones. He threaded his way through a dark alley where the street lights were only hazy halos behind him. Maigret did not run, but his steps were heavy as nails driven into stone, sure and unerring. He knew that Dupre could not disappear, not tonight, not when the fog had closed in on the whole neighborhood like a giant trap. A sudden rain shadow fell, heavy drops imprinting on his coat. Footsteps echoed off the damp walls, mingling with the splashing of water. Dupre entered an old house, the iron door screeching as it was pushed open. Lucas rushed forward, but Maigret held up a hand to stop him. No need. This door has only one exit, and it's locked from the inside. In the darkness, Maigret pulled a cold, black steel key from his pocket. He turned it between his fingers, letting the street lights reflect it. This key, he said, is a copy of the one Dupre used to open the secret police vault. But the interesting thing is, the original has been in my possession since this afternoon. Lucas looked at him, understanding. So, you brought him here in the first place. Maigret merely nodded from inside. Dupre's footsteps echoed, hurried, searching for an escape. But outside, the rain was pouring down harder, and the mist was closing in on all sides. We'll wait, Maigret said softly, as if the whole scene had been planned long ago. Chapter 27. Bargaining in the dark. Dupre's footsteps stopped. The old building fell into a stifling silence, broken only by the sound of rain hitting the rusty tin roof. Maigret leaned against the door frame, lighting a pipe, the smoke mingling with the mist that seeped in through the crack. Lucas waited patiently, his eyes never leaving the closed iron door. Then, from the darkness, came Dupre's voice, hoarse, but no longer defiant. "You know, Maigret, not the one you need." Maigret did not reply at once. He took a puff of his pipe, letting the sentence hang like an untightened noose. "You have the key, which means you planned ahead," Dupre continued. "So you must know. The mastermind behind this is still out there. I am just a loose link. If you arrest me, you will lose him forever." Lucas clenched his fists, ready to rush in, but Maigret raised his hand to stop him, his eyes still fixed on the darkness inside. "So what do you suggest?" Maigret asked, his voice even and low. Another silence. Then Dupre spoke, this time quietly and quickly. "I'll take you to him, but in return, you forget everything tonight. I disappear, no charges, no record." Lucas let out a sarcastic laugh. "You think you're in a position to bargain?" Maigret remained silent, but a glint of light flashed in his deep eyes. He knew that if Dupre could really lead the way to the mastermind, this would be his only chance to bring him to justice. But the price was letting a cunning fox escape. Outside, the distant sound of a train whistle mingled with the heavy rain. Maigret took his pipe from his mouth and walked slowly toward the iron door. "All right," he said, his voice low enough for Dupre to hear. "But remember, I am not a forgetful man." The door opened, and from the darkness, Dupre's eyes shone not the eyes of a victor, but of a man who knew he had just made a pact with the devil. Chapter 28. The man at the end of the alley. The night wind whipped at his face like cold whiplashes. Dupre walked ahead, his dark coat sticking to his back, his breath billowing in white smoke. Maigret and Lucas followed, close enough to control him, far enough away that he did not feel constrained. They walked through the deserted streets, the dim light of street lamps reflecting off the wet stone. The rain had stopped, but drops continued to patter from the roof tiles, like slow ticking time. Dupre led them into a narrow alley, the walls covered with moss and the smell of dampness assaulting their nostrils. At the end of the alley, a heavy wooden door was ajar, a faint yellow light filtering through the gap. "In there," Dupre said, his voice low, You will find what you seek, or what will kill you. Lucas was about to speak, but Maigret raised his hand for silence. He stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on the pistol in his coat pocket. From the other side of the door came a low laugh, not the laugh of someone who was happy, but of someone who knew everything. Maigret looked at Dupré. He knows we're coming. Dupré pursed his lips, his eyes averted. Do you think there's anything he doesn't know? A gust of wind blew past, carrying the smell of cigarette smoke mixed with the metallic scent of blood. Maigret could feel his heart rate slowing the moment before entering the wolf's den. He pushed open the door. Inside was a narrow room with bare gray brick walls and a long wooden table in the middle. A man sat at the head of the table, his face in shadow, only his hands visible long, pale, slowly turning a silver dagger. Hello, Inspector, he said, his voice smooth as velvet, but with a hidden edge. I've been waiting for you. The door behind him closed, and the latch slid into place with a cold clang. Maigret knew the game had just turned into a new one, where every move could be final. Chapter 29. The Mastermind's Proposal. He placed the dagger on the table. The sound of metal hitting wood sounded like a full stop. The light from the hanging lamp fell down, revealing a thin face, deep black eyes, and a smile as faint as a cut. You came here for the truth, he said, but the truth has a price. Maigret, Lucas took half a step forward, but Maigret raised his hand to stop him. He looked him straight in the eye. What is the price? He smiled slightly, slowly opening a thick envelope. From inside, he pulled out a photo. A young woman with her hands tied, her eyes filled with terror. Maigret recognized her immediately. Claire, the only witness who could convict Dupré and the plot behind it. If you back out of this, she will be released. In one piece, he said, his voice as if discussing the weather. But if you go any further, they will pick her up from the docks tomorrow morning. Lucas clenched his fists and walked towards the table. But two men from the corner of the room stepped forward, their eyes cold as ice. Maigret said nothing, but in his mind, all the possibilities began to swirl. If he accepted, he would save a life, but the case would be buried forever. If he refused, he could destroy the entire criminal network. but at the cost of an innocent life. He leaned forward, his voice low. You have only one night to decide. When dawn comes, your choice will no longer be valid. Maigret took a deep breath and looked away from the photograph. But the image of Claire's panicked eyes still stabbed into his mind. He knew he had been drawn into a game where his opponent had calculated every move, and any wrong move would be bloody. The room was so quiet that the ticking of the clock's hands was audible. Maigret said softly, almost in a whisper, "Well then, let us see who will be the final bidder." Chapter 30. Chess Moves in the Dark. As soon as he stepped out of the stuffy room, Maigret did not say a word. Lucas understood, followed closely behind, following his slow pace. Only when the car rolled out of the alley did Maigret speak in a low, steady voice. Lucas, we need to find Claire before he does anything. But he can't know I'm looking for her. Lucas glanced quickly through the rearview mirror. What are you going to do? We have almost no clue. Maigret closed his eyes, recalling every detail of the room, the faint smell of engine oil, the metallic echo as he placed the dagger on the table, and a distant ship's whistle that followed. He opened his eyes. South Harbor. Abandoned warehouses near the shipyard. We'll check tonight. The port at night was unusually quiet. The yellow streetlights were mottled on the water. Maigret and Lucas hid behind old containers, watching. In the distance, a tall, thin figure smoked continuously, glancing around as he walked. Lucas said softly, "His people." Maigret nodded slightly. He signaled to split up. Lucas circled to the left, while he closed in on the shadows. When they were only a few paces away, Maigret deliberately kicked a rusty can. He turned, his hand reaching for his belt, but before he could pull anything out, Lucas was behind him, locking him in place. After a few minutes of rough questioning, the man mumbled an address. Maigret recognized it immediately, an old warehouse, sealed off for smuggling many years ago. They approached the warehouse in silence. The side door was locked with an old iron padlock, and it took Lucas only a few seconds to break it open. It was dark inside, and the smell of damp and salt mixed together. A faint sound came from a distant corner. Maigret raised his hand and signaled. The flashlight beam swung gently, illuminating Claire's pale face and wide eyes. She was tied up, but alive. Maigret knelt down and whispered, "We will get you out of here, but you must be absolutely quiet." Footsteps echoed from outside. There was more than one person. Maigret knew the game had changed. Now he and Lucas were caught in what they thought was their trap.